Welcome to the Times of Israel's daily briefing. Today is Thursday, April 24th, day 566 of the war. Amanda Borschel-Dan here with our U.S. Bureau Chief, Jacob Magid. Hi, Jacob. Thanks for joining me today.
Hey, Amanda. Good to be with you.
Today is Yom Hashoah, Israel's Holocaust Remembrance Day, and it's the day that survivors, released hostages, and hostage family members are actually touring Auschwitz as well for the March of the Living. So please check out this spot for more updates from my colleague Jessica Steinberg as the day progresses. Today, Jacob and I are going to discuss, among other topics, how the hostage release negotiations are taking a bit of a turn for a long-term truce proposed by Hamas, and also how the president of the Palestinian Authority, Mahmoud Abbas, is calling Hamas the son of dogs. All of this and more when we're back. Last night, speaking at the official state Holocaust Remembrance Day ceremony, President Isaac Herzog issued an appeal for national unity. He said that he often meets with Holocaust survivors who share their horrific personal stories, but they all conclude, he said, with the same message: President, please, we beg you, we demand. The division within us is terrible. Let there be unity in the people. Following the president's remarks, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu also spoke after he came late to the ceremony, and he addressed the assembly and said that Hamas is basically the Nazis. He said, indeed, they're exactly like the Nazis, just like Hitler. They wish to kill and destroy all of the Jews, and they openly declare their intention to destroy the state of the Jews. No one will prevent us from defending ourselves, he vowed. No one will tie our hands. If we need to stand alone, we shall stand alone. So, Jacob, let's turn to the ongoing war in Gaza. And you spoke with two Arab officials who discussed the possibility that Hamas is raising a proposal for a long-term truce. It could be 5 years, 10 years, even 15. So give us some details of this.
Sure. So this idea is part of a comprehensive agreement that Hamas is trying to push. And it has basically 5 principles, according to this senior Palestinian official and an Arab diplomat from a country that's involved in negotiations. And they explain them as such. The first is, as we've talked a little bit about before, them offering, is to have one batch of all the hostages returned at once, in exchange for an agreed-upon number of Palestinian security prisoners, a permanent ceasefire, and a full withdrawal of Israeli forces from Gaza, the reopening of crossings to allow aid in and for reconstruction to begin. And then, more interestingly, in terms of this story, first of all, you had Hamas again saying that they're willing to forgo governance control of Gaza to an independent committee of Palestinian technocrats. And as for security arrangements, so that Gaza doesn't threaten Israel, those were the words that, interestingly, Hamas officials have passed along to through mediators to the U.S., that talking about Gaza not threatening Israel, which is just interesting to the way that you could not necessarily expect Hamas officials speaking this way. But they say, we want a years-long truce. We can discuss the length of this with Israel. We're open to even 15 years. They weren't really interested in getting bogged down in a specific number. But during this time, there would be no military activity. And what this means, Hamas is presented in these principles, is that there will be no manufacturing of new weapons, and there will be no tunnel development. Two very significant, you would say, possible concessions on the part of Hamas. On the other hand, this is still a non-starter for Israel and for the U.S. because both those countries are calling for the full disarmament of Hamas. And there have been ideas about maybe Hamas has indicated maybe willingness to put weapons in a secured warehouse that's guarded by a third party, but never any willingness, and Hamas officials say this publicly and privately, that we're not going to simply give up our weapons permanently. That's not something we are willing to do. And even I spoke with Egyptian and Qatari officials who are involved in these mediation process. It's not really something that they're willing to make part of a hostage deal proposal unless it includes a political horizon for the Palestinians, that absent that, we can't expect the Palestinians to give up their weapons, or at least resistance groups won't. It's not realistic to expect them to give up their weapons without that condition. And because Netanyahu and the Israeli government is not interested in it, we haven't really been including that specifically in various hostage deal proposals, despite what I think we've seen some reports suggesting otherwise. But that's kind of where we are, and why one of the many reasons why talks have been stuck for many, many weeks right now, despite continuous efforts by Egypt. I did speak with one Egyptian official who basically said that we don't really have the luxury of trying to give up right now, so we're going to continue trying. And a Qatari prime minister basically offered a similar argument. But for Egypt, I think it was interesting what he said is that A, we have this border with Gaza and it's a national security issue, but B, our aid from the U.S. is on the line. If we kind of are demonstrating that we're not able to bring home the bacon on this issue, there's less willingness for the U.S. possibly to keep that aid going. And we don't trust, like in the past, where Israel was standing up for Egypt and Jordan to make sure that they continue to get U.S. aid. Israel was one of the main lobbyists for that. We're seeing a shift in tone in Washington. I wrote a little bit about this with the newest U.S.-Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Yechiel Leiter, who's been very critical of Egypt. So there's a lot of concern regarding if they give up right now, what that would mean for that continued aid.
I asked this of Laser Behrman yesterday in our podcast, and I'm asking you as well. It appears that the Arab mediators are taking more of the Hamas stance on board than the Israeli stance. Would you think that that is correct based on your discussions with some of these Arab mediators?
Well, I think the role of the Arab mediators is to deal with Hamas, and they feel that they're able to move it only so much, but they can't force it to make decisions that they don't think are realistic. And therefore, on the Israeli side, they're trusting the U.S. to be the one to push Israel, and that's their role. And so I think they focus on what they think is realistic within their roles and their negotiations with the Arab parties. I think it's nuanced, but yes, I agree. They're more focused on less, I think, adopting Israeli approaches or Israeli talking points or demands because they just don't think they're realistic.
And they do think that the Hamas stances are realistic, because obviously the prime minister, even during his speech at Yad Vashem commemorating the Holocaust, was saying adamantly that Hamas will be wiped off the Gaza Strip. So when you're talking about some kind of political horizon, I mean, what has been discussed is this council of technocrats. Does Hamas see themselves as part of it?
No. So that's part of Hamas's willingness to forgo governance. I think these Arab mediators would say, or definitely Egypt more so than Qatar, but Egypt for sure, which is not a fan of the Muslim Brotherhood, does want to see Hamas as sidelined as possible from the situation in Gaza, and starting with the governance, and feels that the way to really eventually disarm Hamas is through a political alternative, and arguing that you can't expect one to be stood up without giving the Palestinians a say in it and an involvement through the Palestinian authorities, their preferred vessel. They recognize that it needs to be reformed, but without a viable Palestinian alternative, they say that we're not going to get the eventual disarmament that Bibi's talking about, because Hamas will still be seen as a legitimate option because there's just no other ones in Gaza.
Okay, let's get to a short break and then we'll discuss some comments out of the Palestinian Authority. And we're back. So during a speech at the opening of the PLO Central Council meeting last week, Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas called Hamas sons of dogs and told the terror group to release hostages it is holding in order to eliminate what he said is Israel's pretext to continue its war in Gaza. Now, quote, "The first priority is to stop the war of extermination in Gaza. It must be stopped. Hundreds are being killed every day. Why don't you hand over the American hostages?" So there is only one living American hostage, as far as I'm aware. What is he talking about here in terms of the American hostages and this condemnation, calling Hamas sons of dogs? That sounds probably a lot worse in Arabic, but it doesn't sound so good in English as well. So talk to us a little bit about this.
So there were two parts where he talks about calling on Hamas to give over the hostages. One of them, he's referring saying even the American hostages you're not willing to give up, and he's criticizing them on that. I think you could say maybe he's referring not just to Idan and Alexander, but also the bodies of the 4 American hostages that are also a high priority for the Trump administration and getting them released. And then he just speaks more generally about Hamas should just give up the hostages, stop giving Israel excuses to continue the war in Gaza is how he frames it. And yes, he uses very harsh words against Hamas. I think, again, this is kind of a continuation of what we've been seeing over the past few weeks or so, where, as I mentioned in the last time we spoke about the Taylor Force Act, where one of the conditions is condemning terror. And I think this is the way that Abu Mazen is going about doing it, is to repeatedly call out Hamas, which the U.S. considers and Israel obviously consider a terrorist organization. And I think it's the way he hopes to check that box in order to hopefully come into compliance with this U.S. legislation that will allow for the restoration of direct aid that directly benefits the Palestinian Authority. But I think it is kind of easy, if you're looking at it cynically, that it's always Hamas has always been a rival to Palestinian President Mahmoud Abbas. They've never gotten along. Reconciliation efforts have never really worked. So I don't think this is a huge concession from him. And I'm also not really totally sure how much Washington is really paying attention. They have the National Security Council. I just noticed this week they have typically there was under previous administrations, it's called the Director of Israeli-Palestinian Affairs or something around those lines. And they've dropped the term Palestinian from that title of the person who's holding that position. The State Department is really being gut, and there are dozens of diplomatic missions around the world who are being closed. And I've spoken to some in Jerusalem who are worried that the Office of Palestinian Affairs that was reopened sort of during the Biden administration, that could be on the chopping block too. So there's a lot less focus, I think, in Washington on this issue of Israeli-Palestinian relations. What is interesting, though, is that President Abbas is on his way to Syria right now. And Israel tried to block his plane from going there, feeling that they don't want the PA having relations with the new Syrian regime, Ahmed Ashara. They feel that he's an Islamist. They call him a terrorist. And they tried to block his plane. And actually, the U.S. did intervene in this case on Abbas's behalf and make sure that his plane was allowed to fly to Syria so he could hold this first meeting with Ashara. So there is a little bit of U.S. involvement on the Palestinian issue, but we'll see if it's enough for them to take notice of some of these criticisms of Hamas that Abbas has been making as of late.
So Abbas is no spring chicken, although he is getting around. He's flying around all over the world. And I wonder if you have any information on his likely successors and their stances regarding Hamas or even regarding Israel.
So this week there's a meeting of the PLO Executive Committee, and there's a lot of talk about what likely will happen is that he will be appointing a deputy. This has been something that the international community has been pushing for a long time, and the hope is that this deputy will be also given powers and given a role in the succession process, possibly that this person would be named as the successor if before an election is held. And the person likely to be picked is Hussein al-Sheikh, according to sources I've spoken with. He's currently the PLO Secretary General, so already a very powerful position, and this will give him more clout. I think Abu Mazen has long trusted Hussein al-Sheikh. There have been some points where I think they've ruffled feathers, but that's been the case with a lot of other people in the orbit. And I think it'll be interesting to see whether or not, in addition to giving him this role of deputy, whether it actually comes with powers. So there's going to be a lot of eyes in Ramallah for this meeting this week.
So this week, you, Jacob, you spoke with the father of Idan Alexander, Adi, and he is pushing for more direct negotiations, which is definitely something that Israel was firmly against when it came to light. Is this, I'm not saying just, because I think any parent in this situation would try every method, every effort possible to get their child out. But do you see it as something deeper than that, or just a way of, obviously not just, or as a way of making the talks proceed in some kind of fruitful manner?
Yeah, I think the way that the Alexander family looks at it is that the closest that their son Idan was to getting released was under these direct negotiations that Adam Bowler, the hostage envoy for the Trump administration, held unprecedentedly with Hamas at the beginning of March. They got a deal that was presented. Hamas waffled, and by the time they came back to the table, the talks had been leaked. The U.S. had moved away from them amid pressure and anger from Israel and Republicans. But still, the feeling was that this was the closest we got to Idan being released. And it actually isn't just the Alexander family, who were obviously the main ones to benefit from these talks, but other hostage families I've spoken with as well, who feel that Bohler is very dedicated to this issue. And they didn't really have a principled problem with these direct negotiations that Bohler held. For now, it still seems that Adam Bohler has been sidelined from this issue. He does have a new title that he was given after he rescinded his nomination to be a presidential envoy. He's still going to be dealing with this issue. But specifically on the issue of Israel-Gaza and trying to get the American hostages out, which is part of his remit, for now, it doesn't seem to be the case. I think the willingness of the Trump administration, it seems, to stand up to Israel on this issue seems a little bit less. I think maybe possibly because they're dealing with the Iran front and coming out against Israel for the way that they're handling these direct negotiations with Iran, which is not something Israel likes. So to also try to come out against Israel on this issue as well seems a little bit less likely. And accordingly, the direct talks led by Adam Bohler have not happened again. But I think basically the feeling is because they're stuck, we need to be trying something else. And at least Adam is more focused on this issue, just given that Witkoff has so many other files that he's dealing with. Steve Witkoff, the U.S. envoy, also is dealing with Iran and Ukraine and Russia. So there's just so much on his plate. He has a very thin staff. And the feeling is that at least Adam Bohler could maybe have more time to focus on this issue and get at least the American loved ones out. The American hostages out, the four bodies and Idan Alexander, but also the goal of those talks were to use those as a springboard to get a larger deal once you have the momentum going.
So you're talking about the approach from the hostage families that Witkoff has too much on his plate and isn't able to devote the time. And I wonder what you're hearing from behind the scenes in Washington from any of the U.S. officials. Are they having these same murmurings, these same criticisms? Are you hearing any of that?
No, I think there's complete loyalty from, at least in the administration, to the way that Steve Witkoff is handling this. There was a CNN profile about Steve Witkoff that was largely pretty positive, I think, but it did include some criticisms from former officials or long-term diplomats who are saying that he's kind of a lone wolf, he doesn't have a full staff, that he kind of doesn't operate very traditionally. And then you saw this flood of responses from every one of the main Trump administration folks. So from Mike Waltz to Marco Rubio and others who came immediately to Witkoff's defense. So I think there's a lot of appreciation for what Steve Witkoff does. And I think he does have the ability to pressure Netanyahu and Hamas like he did in January to secure this deal. But there's just a feeling that, he's just so stretched thin and nobody else is really given the remit to handle these talks, at least given that Bohler's not been allowed to return to those direct negotiations. But at the same time, when you speak to hostage families, at least, I think they recognize this, but they're not going to be willing to criticize the Trump administration publicly because they feel that risks putting their loved ones, the risks maybe Trump moving on to another issue, I think. And that's why you've seen a continuous playing up to Trump's ego and thinking of Witkoff because A, he has done more than the Biden administration was able to do, but B, also because they recognize that this is the game they have to play, I think, a little bit in order to hopefully get their loved ones out.
Jacob, I'm going to end our program with an update about a shark attack that's brought a lot of headlines throughout the world. And a man was killed in a shark attack off the coast of Hadera. The police confirmed this on Wednesday after human remains were positively identified by forensic experts. The victim was named as 45-year-old Barak Tzach, who is the father of 4 from Petach Tikva. It is just the third recorded shark attack in Israel since the 1940s. One person was killed in an attack in the 1940s. And what's happening is that the area is experiencing warm water. We are here in Israel having what we call a sharav, a very warm, hot temperature zone. It's very terribly hot here, which is leading to, of course, wildfires that were experienced throughout the country on Wednesday, leading to very terrible smoke throughout the country. But near a power plant off the coast of Hadera, the sea is very warm, and for years dozens of sharks have been attracted to it, and the Israeli public is told not to swim there. Of course, Israelis flocked in large numbers to the beach during the week-long holiday of Passover, and many of them decided to swim with the sharks, and some tugged on the sharks' fins, and others tried to feed the sharks.
As one does.
And it's terrible. There's no indication that Barak Tzach had any fish or was feeding the sharks. It is a terrible, terrible incident that was unfortunately recorded by several dozen people who were watching him being attacked. And just to repeat what the Parks Authority says, and any scientist, don't feed the sharks, don't go and swim with the sharks, and animals are dangerous. So unfortunately, one man has died in this incident, and hopefully other Israelis and others will decide not to enter the waters while the sharks are swimming there. So, Jacob, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks for having me, Amanda.
Thanks for listening to the Times of Israel's Daily Briefing. Please check out another episode tomorrow. This episode was produced by the Podwaves and video edited by Thomas Gersh. If you have any questions or comments about this or any other episode, please drop us an email to podcast@timesofisrael.com. Until tomorrow, Shalom.